This is Audible.
Audible Inc. presents The Unseen. Part 1, It Begins. Written by Richie Tankersley Cusick. Narrated by Christine Williams. Prologue. She had deceived him. He realized now with a terrible certainty that she'd deceived him from the beginning, planned this whole thing from the very start. And she knew everything about him, everything. What he was and what he'd done, and all he was capable of doing. She'd sought him out and gained his trust for one purpose and one purpose only: to see him destroyed. After he'd been so careful, so cunning all these years, concealing the very nature of his soul, the ageless secrets of his kind. And he'd trusted her, taken her, loved her more than he'd ever loved anyone. Tears clouded his vision, as though he were seeing the future through a dark red haze, a veil of blood. He glanced down at his hands, his strong, gentle fingers wielding the power of life and death. He hadn't even realized he was gripping the dagger of his ancestors, nor did he remember even drawing it from its sheath. He was gripping the blade so tightly that a stream of his own blood seeped from his fist. He watched it, strangely mesmerized, as it dripped onto the cold stone floor and pooled around his feet. He hadn't thought he could feel such pain. Not from the knife, for he had borne far worse injuries than this in his lifetime, had suffered the ravages of 1,000 tortures. But those scars had faded quickly, like shadows swallowed by night, and the few that remained were points of honor to him now, sacred testimonies to his very survival. No, this pain was different. This pain burned from deep within, filling him with rage and a craving for revenge. A craving so intense he could almost taste it. Chapter 1. She should never have come here, not into this deep, dark place, not in this miserable weather, and especially not at night. "A graveyard," Lucy murmured. "What was I thinking?" But that was just it. She hadn't been thinking. She hadn't had time to think. She'd only felt that sudden surge of fear through her veins, and then she'd started running. Someone was following her. Not at first, not when she'd first left the house and started walking, but blocks afterward, 6 or 7 maybe, when the storm had suddenly broken and she'd cut through an alley behind a church and tried to find a shortcut home. No, not home! The words exploded inside her head, angry and defensive. "Aunt Irene's house isn't home. It won't ever be home. I don't have a home anymore." The rain was cold. Even with her jacket, Lucy felt chilled, and she hunched her shoulders against the downpour, pulled her hood close around her face. She hadn't even realized where she was going. There was no sign posted, no gate to mark the boundaries of this cemetery, just an unexpected gap through the trees. She'd heard the footsteps and she'd panicked. She'd bolted instinctively into the first cover of darkness she could find. But this was a terrible darkness, almost as dark as her own pain. She crouched down between 2 headstones, straining her ears through the night. It had taken her several minutes to become aware of those footsteps back there on the sidewalk, and at first she'd thought she was imagining them. She'd thought it was only the rain plopping down, big soft drops, faint at first, but then louder and faster, sharper and clearer, until suddenly they seemed to be echoing, until suddenly they seemed to have some awful purpose, and she realized they were coming closer. She'd stopped beneath a street lamp, and the footsteps had stopped too. She'd forced herself to look back along the pavement, across the shadowy lawns and thick tangled hedges. but there hadn't been anyone behind her. No one she could see, anyway. But someone was there. Someone. She was sure of it, and that's when she'd run. "I'm afraid you'll find Pine Ridge very different from what you're used to." How many times had Irene told her that, just in the one agonizing week Lucy had been here? "We're right on the lake, of course, and the university's here, so there's plenty to do. And we're only a half-hour drive to the city. But our neighborhood is quiet. Rather exclusive, actually. Peaceful and private, just the way residents like it. Not at all like that old apartment of yours in the middle of downtown." But Lucy had loved her old apartment, the tiny third-floor walk-up that she and her mother had filled with all their favorite things. And the sorrow she'd felt at leaving it only grew worse with each passing day. She'd been too depressed on their ride from the airport that day to notice much about Pine Ridge. She had only the vaguest recollections of Aunt Irene pointing things out to her as they'd ridden through town. The college campus with its weathered brick buildings and stately oaks. The renovated historical district with its town square and gazebo. Its bars, coffee shops, and open-air cafes. Its bookstores and art galleries and booths selling local crafts. They'd passed farms and fields to get here, and she'd caught occasional glimpses of the lake through dense, shadowy forests. And there'd been frost sheening the hillsides, and she remembered thinking that she'd never seen so many trees, so many vibrant autumn colors. "And it's safe here in Pine Ridge," her aunt had assured her. "Unpleasant things don't happen." "You're wrong, Aunt Irene." Lucy pressed a hand to her temple. That all-too-familiar pain was starting again, throbbing behind her eyes, stabbing through her head. That agony of unshed tears, of inconsolable sorrow. "You're wrong, because unpleasant things do happen, anywhere. Horrible, bad things, and just when you think they couldn't possibly ever happen to you." "Oh, Mom," Lucy whispered. "Why do you have to die?" For a split second, reality threatened to crush her. Closing her eyes, she bent forward and clamped her knees tight against her chest. She willed herself to take deep, even breaths, but the smell of stagnant earth and rotting leaves sent a deep shiver of nausea through her. "Don't think about that now. You can't think about that now. Mom's gone, and you have to get out of here." Very slowly, she lifted her head. Maybe the footsteps had followed her in here. Maybe someone was waiting close by, hiding in the shadows, waiting for her to make the slightest move. Or maybe someone was coming closer and closer this very second, searching methodically behind every tombstone, and she'd never hear the footsteps now, not on the soggy ground, not with the sound of the rain, not until it was too late. Come on, move, run! But where? Where could she go? She wasn't even sure where she was, much less which direction to run in. Unpleasant things don't happen. Lucy's heart hammered in her chest. She clung desperately to her aunt's words. She ordered herself to believe them. Maybe she really had imagined those footsteps back there. Maybe it had just been the rain, and she'd panicked for nothing. After all, she hadn't really been herself since Mom's funeral. As mechanical as a robot, and just as hollow inside, moving in slow motion through an endless gray fog of days and nights, confused by the long, empty lapses in her memory. But shock did that to a person, Aunt Irene had informed her, in that cool, detached tone Lucy was beginning to get used to. Shock and grief, and the unbearable pain of losing someone you love. I can do this. I have to do this. Lucy got to her feet. Steadying herself against one of the headstones, she pushed her long wet hair back from her face, then turned slowly, blue eyes squinting hard into the gloom. High above her, the limbs of a giant elm flailed wildly in the wind, sending down a soggy shower of leaves. The sky gushed like a waterfall. As the moon flickered briefly through churning clouds, she saw nothing but graves in every direction. Just dead people, Lucy, and dead people can't hurt you. The storm clouds shifted, swallowing the moonlight once more. Swearing softly, Lucy ducked her head and ran. She didn't have a clue where she was going. She'd never had any real talent for directions, and now she ran blindly, stumbling across uneven ground, weaving between headstones, falling over half-buried markers on forgotten graves. She wondered if Aunt Irene or Angela would be missing her about now, or if they even realized she was gone. Or care, Lucy muttered to herself. The truth was, she'd hardly seen Angela since their initial, and totally awkward, introduction. Angela, with her perfectly flowing waves of jet-black hair and tall, willowy model's figure, had been slumped in the doorway of her walk-in closet, smoking a cigarette and surveying her extensive wardrobe with a petulant frown. "Angela, for heaven's sake!" Irene had promptly shut off the CD player that was blasting rock music through the room. "This is your cousin Lucy." Angela's eyes had barely even glanced in Lucy's direction. Huge, dark eyes ringed with even darker layers of mascara. "So?" It hadn't been said in a rude way exactly, more apathetic if anything, but Lucy had felt hurt all the same. "And get rid of that disgusting cigarette," Irene had ordered, shoving an ashtray toward her daughter. "You know how I feel about smoke in the house? And would it kill you to be civil just once, on Lucy's first night here? After all, you two are the same age. You probably have a lot in common." Angela hadn't flinched. "You're kidding, right?" "Fine then, very fine, Angela. From now on, I don't care how the two of you handle it. You girls will have to work things out between yourselves." A careless shrug. "Whatever." "Honestly, Angela, you never think about anyone but yourself," Irene had persisted. Angela had reached over then, mashed out her cigarette in the ashtray her mom was still holding. She'd raised her arms above her head, stood on tiptoes, and stretched like a long, lean cat. And then she'd walked very slowly, very deliberately, out of the room. "Of course they won't care," Lucy muttered again. She hadn't told either of them she was leaving earlier. She doubted if they'd have understood her desperate need to escape the house where she still felt so lonely and unwelcome. All Lucy had thought about was getting away, and so the darkness of empty streets had felt comforting to her then. But now she felt stupid for being so scared, for getting so lost. She should have gone back the way she'd come. She shouldn't have listened to her overactive imagination. Damn it! Without warning, she stubbed her toe and pitched forward, landing face down in the mud. For a second she lay there, too surprised to move. Then slowly, carefully, she reached forward to push herself up. Her hands met only air. Gasping, she lifted her head and stared in horror. Even in this downpour, she could see the deep, rectangular hole yawning below her, and she realized it was an open grave. She was sprawled on the very edge of it, and as she clawed frantically for something to hold on to, she felt the ground melting away beneath her fingers. With one last effort, she twisted sideways, just as a huge chunk of earth dissolved and slid to the bottom of the chasm. And that's when she heard the cry. Soft at first, like the low moan of wind through branches, or the whimper of a frightened animal, faint and muffled, drowned by the rush of the rain. An abandoned cat, maybe? A stray dog? Some poor outcast just as lost as she was, wandering alone out here in the dark? Lucy's heart broke at the thought of it. "Here, baby!" Stumbling to her feet, she cupped her hands around her mouth and tried to shout over the tremor in her voice. "Come to me! Don't be afraid!" A rumble of thunder snaked its way through the cemetery. As Lucy paused to listen, she felt a sudden chill up her spine. Yes, there was the sound again, coming from the empty grave. Chapter 2. As if trapped in a nightmare, Lucy forced herself to peer down into the gaping hole. She was sure she hadn't imagined the sound this time, certain now that it wasn't an animal. The voice was all too frighteningly human. "Please," it was begging her. "Please." Pressing both hands to her mouth, Lucy tried not to scream. For she could see now that the grave wasn't empty at all, that there was something lying at the very bottom, camouflaged by layers of mudslide and rising rainwater. As a sliver of lightning split the clouds, she saw the girl's head strain upward, lips gasping for air, and then the girl's arm lifting slowly, reaching out to her. "Please, is someone there?" Lucy stood paralyzed. She watched in horror as the girl's head fell back again into the mire, as water closed over the anguished face. Oh my God! She didn't remember jumping in. From some hazy part of her brain came vague sensations of sliding, of falling, of being buried alive, as the earth crumbled in around her and the ground sucked her down. She lunged for the body beneath the water. She tried to brace herself, but her feet kept slipping in the mud. Dropping to her knees, she managed to raise the girl's head and cradle it in her arms. "Help!" she screamed. "Somebody help us!" Was the girl dead? Lucy couldn't tell, but the body was limp and heavy and motionless now, the eyes and lips closed. She could hardly see anything in this darkness, only brief flashes of the livid face as lightning flickered over the girl's delicate features. Ghostly white cheeks, dark swollen bruises. A scarf wound tight around her neck. "Somebody! Somebody help us!" Yet even as she shouted, Lucy knew no one would hear her, not through this wind and rain, not in this place of the dead. With numb fingers, she worked feverishly at the scarf, but the wet material was knotted and wouldn't budge. In desperation, she smoothed the girl's matted hair and leaned closer to comfort her. "Hang on, okay? I'm going to get you out of here, but I have to leave, just for a little while, and get help. I'll be back as quick as I—" Something clamped onto her wrist. As Lucy's words choked off, she could see the thin, pale hand clinging to her own, the muddy fingers lacing slowly between her own fingertips. They began to squeeze. "Oh, God!" Lucy whimpered. "Stop!" Pain shot through the palm of her hand. Pain like she'd never felt before. Waves like fire, burning, scalding through every nerve and muscle, throbbing the length of her fingers, pulsing upward through her hand, her wrist, along her arm, piercing her heart and her head. Pain so intense she couldn't even scream. Her body began to shake uncontrollably. Her strength drained in a dizzying rush. Through a blur of strange blue light, she saw the girl's head turn toward her, saw the scarf slip easily from the fragile neck. She saw the jagged gash across the girl's throat, the raw, stringy flesh, the glimmer of bone. Lucy pitched forward. The girl's body was soft beneath her, cushioning her fall, and from some great distance she heard her own voice crying out at last, though she understood somehow that this was only in her mind. "Who did this to you? What's happening?" "Listen," the girl whispered. Had her lips moved? Had she spoken aloud? Lucy didn't think so, yet she could hear this girl, could hear her just as clearly as two best friends sharing secrets. Dazed and weak, she managed to lift herself onto one elbow. The girl was staring at her now, wide eyes boring into hers with an intensity both chilling and compelling. Lucy was helpless to look away. "Tell no one," the girl said, and her lips did not move. and Lucy could only gaze into those huge dark eyes and listen to the silence. "Do you understand? Promise me you understand." Lucy felt herself nod. Tears ran down her cheeks and streamed with the rain over the girl's cold skin. The hand holding hers slid away. The dark eyes shifted from her face to something far beyond her, something Lucy couldn't see. "If you want to live," the girl murmured, "you mustn't tell anyone, not anyone, what you've seen here tonight." "Don't die," Lucy begged. "Please don't die." "Promise me." Yes, I promise." The girl's eyelids slowly closed. But for one split second, Lucy could have sworn that she smiled. Chapter 3. She didn't remember climbing out of the grave. She didn't remember running or even finding her way out of the cemetery. But suddenly there were lights in the distance, and muffled voices, and the wild pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. Lucy stopped, gasping for breath. She realized she was standing on a low rise, with a sidewalk about 30 yards below her. She could see street lights glowing fuzzy through the rain, and beyond that, the watery reflections of headlights from passing cars. "Oh God, what should I do?" She couldn't stop shaking. She couldn't get warm, couldn't think. Her knees felt like rubber, and it was all she could do to force herself the rest of the way down the hill. Maybe it didn't really happen. Maybe I fell into a hole back there and knocked myself out and started hallucinating. She wanted to believe that with every fiber of her being, because to accept what she'd just seen in the cemetery was too horrifying to deal with. Nothing seemed real anymore. Not the rain beating down on her, or even the nice, solid feel of the pavement as she finally reached the curb and peered to the opposite side of the street. There was a gas station on the corner, lights on but pumps deserted, and the voices she'd heard were actually coming from loudspeakers playing country music. Again Lucy stopped. She glanced behind her into the darkness, into the hidden secrets of the graveyard, and her mind whirled in an agony of indecision. I promised her. And yes, it had been real, and there was a girl maybe her own age, lying dead. And no matter how sacred a promise, Lucy knew she couldn't just leave her there all alone in the rain. "If you want to live, you won't tell anyone." The girl's words echoed back to her, chilling her to the bone. Maybe it wasn't really a warning, she argued to herself. Maybe it didn't mean anything at all. She knew people often said strange things when they were dying, when they were out of their heads from pain and confusion, and that final slipping away from the world. Like Mom was at the end. Like Mom was... "No," Lucy whispered to herself. "Not now." She took a deep breath and shut her eyes, but she couldn't shut out the image of those other eyes, those pleading, desperate eyes gazing up at her from the girl's bloodless face. Without even realizing it, she flexed her hand inside her jacket pocket. There was a vague sensation of pain, but she was too preoccupied to give it attention. As she stared over at the gas station, she suddenly noticed a drive-by telephone at one end of the parking area, and she knew what she had to do. Keeping her head down, Lucy hurried across the street. Someone was working under the hood of a car inside the garage, but the lot was still deserted, and the phone was far enough away that she didn't think she'd be noticed. She grabbed up the receiver and punched in 911, telling herself she wasn't really breaking her promise. It was only a compromise. 911, what is your emergency? Lucy froze. "You won't tell anyone." 911, what is your emergency, please? "Promise me." "Hello, please state your emergency." "Yes, Lucy whispered. Yes, I... Without warning, a horn blared behind her. Lucy slammed down the receiver and whirled around as a red Corvette screeched to a stop about 3 feet away. Then one of the windows slid down. You picked a hell of a night to run away, Angela greeted her blandly. Lucy shook her head. Despite the fact that it was Angela, she felt an immense sense of relief. I'm not running away. Oh. She was sure her cousin sounded disappointed. The thought actually occurred to her to just turn and leave, but then she saw Angela nod toward the passenger door. So get in already. Don't you know enough to come in out of the rain? With a last glance at the phone, Lucy hurried around the car and climbed into the front seat. What am I going to do now? Anxiously, she wiped one sleeve over her wet face, then held out both hands to the heater. Look at this mess. Angela rolled her eyes. You're dripping all over everything. Sorry. Scooting back, Lucy angled herself into the corner. She clamped her arms tightly around her chest, but the shivering wouldn't stop. Do you have a towel or something? No, I haven't got a towel. God, look at my floor. I got lost, was all Lucy could think of to say. Angela grumbled something under her breath. She plucked a lighted cigarette from the ashtray, took a long drag, then blew a thin stream of smoke out through her nose. Irene's freaking out, she said at last. I'm sorry. I just wanted to take a walk, but then I got all turned around in the storm. I didn't mean to worry anybody. Oh, she's not worried about you. Angela seemed mildly amused. She's freaking out because you've made her late for a meeting. Lucy bit hard on her bottom lip. She could feel a lump burning in her throat. Anger and tears mixed bitterly together, but she was determined not to cry. Well, she managed to whisper, of course she would be. You should have known better. What? Angela rolled her eyes. If you think wandering off like this is going to get you any attention or sympathy from Irene, then forget it. You don't know her. But I want to, Lucy thought miserably. And I want her to know me, too. Right after she'd moved here, Lucy had made a habit of studying her aunt's face whenever Irene wasn't watching, longing for just a glimpse of the mother she'd lost, as if somehow her mother's spirit would be reflected in Irene's eyes, or in her clothes, or in the way she did things, living proof to Lucy that her mom was still with her. But there'd been no similarities whatsoever between the two women, and as the days passed, Lucy only felt more and more abandoned. No matter that Aunt Irene was her only living relative, Irene and Mom were as different as night and day. Mom had been so alive. Fun and free-spirited, spontaneous and creative, with the wildest imagination and the most contagious laugh and the most stubborn determination when her mind was made up about something. Lucy had always admired her mother's disregard for rules and routines. There'd always been new things to try and new adventures to share on the spur of the moment. And she'd always loved hearing how much alike the two of them looked. The same blue-gray eyes and long, thick lashes. The same silky blonde hair. Mom had been a source of pride to her, a role model, an ideal she'd always aspired to. She'd never known her father, but Mom had been the best of both parents, not to mention her very best friend. Her whole world, really. But now there was Aunt Irene. Just Irene, who didn't seem anything like the sister she'd completely shut out of her life. Irene, who barely spoke to Lucy, barely even looked at her if she could help it, who always acted tense and watchful and guarded, as though she expected something bad or dangerous to sneak up on her at any second. Irene and her high-profile job at the university. Irene and her endless, very important meetings. She's self-absorbed, Mom had always told Lucy in those rare moments she ever mentioned Irene's name. She's always been self-absorbed. She's never thought about anyone but herself. The only thing that makes her happy is getting her own way. Lucy had never understood the estrangement between her mother and her aunt. Mom had always refused to talk about it. All she knew was that the women hadn't spoken for years. But when Mom was dying, trapped in the last throes of cancer, she'd requested, finally, that Irene be told. And Irene had come. To Lucy's shock, Irene had come and stayed. She'd doled out medications, stocked the refrigerator with takeout food, obsessively cleaned and tidied, and remained aloof while Lucy kept constant vigil in Mom's bedroom. And then something had happened one night. Something behind the closed door of Mom's room. Something between Mom and Irene alone. Something never discussed with Lucy. All Lucy knew was that Mom had suddenly seemed calm and strangely resolved, and the next morning, while Lucy sat beside her holding both her hands, Mom had slipped peacefully away. Lucy didn't remember much after that. Over the next few days, the funeral had been arranged. Over the next few weeks, the apartment had been cleared out and re-rented. Her things had been systematically discarded, packed, or put into storage. All by Aunt Irene, she supposed, for she'd been too numb with grief even to function. And then Irene had brought her here. "We're your family now, Lucy," Irene had announced in her cool, businesslike way. "This is your home." And some home, Lucy had thought in awe, laying eyes on the house for the very first time. Compared to the size and comfortable shabbiness of her old apartment, this new place seemed like a mansion, with its white brick walls and tall front columns, its circular driveway, its swimming pool in back. Yet surrounded as it was by thick woods and only a short walk to the lake, Lucy would have sworn they were in the middle of a vast, lonely wilderness if Irene hadn't assured her that town was only a few blocks away. Lucy had decided immediately that her life and her happiness were over. "Looking for you is not how I plan to spend my evening." With a jolt, Lucy came back to herself. She had no idea how long she'd been buried in her thoughts or how long Angela had been talking. She glanced at her cousin, but those dark-ringed eyes were focused on the rhythmic movement of the windshield wipers. "I talked her out of calling the police, you know," Angela added. "The police?" Lucy's tone was grim. "I thought nothing unpleasant ever happened in Pine Ridge." "Who told you that?" "Your mother," Lucy mumbled, wishing they could just leave. She didn't want to sit here anymore, here where she could see the cemetery right across the street. She didn't want to sit here knowing what she knew, and she didn't want to remember anything that had happened tonight, because she was cold and hungry and exhausted, and if her 911 call had been traced, then she especially didn't want to be here when the police showed up. But Angela took another long puff and glanced at Lucy with a tight smile. "How funny." "What?" "Nothing unpleasant ever happening here, and Irene, of all people, saying so." Lucy frowned. "What do you—" she began, but Angela cut her off, gesturing vaguely toward the parking lot. "So what were you doing just now? Trying to call somebody?" Lucy stole a quick look at the phone box outside the car. How long did someone have to stay on the line for a call to be traced? How long did it take the police to find someone in Pine Ridge? "Yes." Her mind was racing. The smoke was making her feel claustrophobic. "I was trying to call your house, but I couldn't remember the number." "Well, I don't know where you were walking," Angela said matter-of-factly, "but you look like a zombie." Lucy cringed. She thought of the girl in the grave. A sick taste of guilt welled up inside her, and she swallowed hard, forcing it down. "Can we please go?" "Oh, great. You're not going to get sick in my car, are you?" "I hope not." To Lucy's relief, Angela instantly buzzed down the driver's window and flicked her half-smoked cigarette out into the rain. Then she rolled the window up again, sat back, and turned up the heater full blast. "Thanks," Lucy said. "I appreciate it." "I didn't do it for you. I did it for my car." "Of course you did. What was I thinking?" Lucy tensed, listening. Was that a siren she'd just heard in the distance? Or only a muted sound from the radio? Please, please, let's just leave. "Look, let's get this straight. If you came here expecting money, Irene's not going to change her will. You're not going to get one bit of the inheritance." Angela's voice was stony. "Just so you know." Lucy faced her in surprise. "I didn't come here for your money. I didn't come here for anything, Angela. I didn't even want to come here. It wasn't my idea. Your mother made me come here." She hesitated, then said, "Just so you know." "She's not my mother," Angela muttered. "What?" "I said she's not my mother. She's my stepmother." Reaching over, Angela readjusted the heater again, then leaned back with an exasperated sigh. "My father married her when I was 10, and then he died 2 years later, and I was stuck with her. We've never gotten along, Irene and me. We've always hated each other, and I'm leaving here just as soon as—" Abruptly, Angela broke off. She reached for a fresh cigarette, and Lucy could see how she trembled with anger. "As soon as I turn 18, Angela finished defiantly. She held a lighter to the tip of her cigarette, the tiny spark glowing orange in the dark. "As soon as I'm 18, I'm taking off for New Orleans," she murmured again. "That's when I inherit my money, and I can do what I want. Till then, I'm a goddamn hostage." Lucy gave a distracted nod. No, it's not a siren. It's going away now, in another direction." Taking a deep breath, she tried to focus once more on the girl beside her. "I didn't know anything about you," Lucy admitted, unsure what else to say. "Not about you or Irene. My mom barely mentioned Irene the whole time I was growing up. I'm really sorry." Angela's eyes widened, almost mockingly. "Sorry? Don't be sorry for me. Don't ever be sorry for me. I can take care of myself just fine." "Angela, I didn't mean—" "Just forget it. Who the hell do you think you are?" "I don't know anymore," Lucy thought miserably. "I used to know, but everything's different now. I'm different now." She was beginning to feel sick again. She wanted to leave, wanted Angela to stop talking and start driving. She could feel the girl's eyes upon her, and she could still see the eyes of that dead girl. And there was too much death, death in her past and death tonight. She was drowning in it, drowning in all this death. And if we don't leave right this minute, I'm going to totally lose it and start screaming. "God, what do you touch?" Angela asked suddenly. "Touch?" A chill crawled up Lucy's spine, though she managed to keep her voice steady. "What do you mean?" And Angela was leaning closer now, staring harder, her eyes like big black hollows in the shadows of the car. "There," Angela told her. "There on your hand." Startled, Lucy looked down. She stared at the narrow black welts on the back of her right hand and between her fingers, at the misshapen black stain on the skin of her palm. In one more quicksilver flash, she saw the girl in the open grave, remembered the girl's hand closing around her own. I don't know," she heard herself whisper. "When I fell, maybe. That's what happened. I tripped, and I must have bruised myself when I fell." For an endless moment, there was silence. "That's no bruise," Angela said at last. She pulled the Corvette back onto the street and peeled away, but Lucy scarcely noticed, because the thing on her hand really didn't look like a bruise. It looked like a burn, like something had burned itself right into her skin. Chapter 4. He'd come back one last time, just to make sure she was dead. Some killers didn't like to come back, he realized, for fear of being seen, being connected in some way, being caught. These dangers, of course, were of no concern to him. But after he'd done what he had to do, he couldn't get her out of his mind. He'd stood at his window watching the rain, replaying her voice over and over again in his head, her pleas for mercy, her screams of pain. And suddenly he'd begun to grow restless in a way he couldn't understand. A strange uneasiness in his veins that made him pace in the dark and jump at small sounds and warily watch the shadows. And so he'd come back. One last time. She was just as he'd left her, naturally, and this soothed him a little. He'd stood over the crumbling grave, and he'd stared down at her, and he'd stood for such a long, long time, waiting to see if she'd speak, if she'd move, if her eyes would open, if she'd look at him in the old familiar way he'd so loved being looked at. But she didn't move, and she didn't say his name. The water and the mud were over her face, from the walls of the grave caving in, and if he hadn't put her there himself, he'd never have known she was there at all. He'd have thought she was just a pathetic mound of soggy earth at the bottom of the yawning hole. He really was so amazingly clever. The old graveyard, a violent storm. No one in Pine Ridge would even consider venturing into this place tonight. So he'd thrown his arms wide to the rain, and his hair had blown wild in the wind, and he'd sucked in the darkness until it filled him and sated him and consumed him, and then that restlessness again, that vague, creeping uneasiness gnawing in the pit of his soul. He'd actually felt a moment of doubt, and so he'd lowered himself into her grave. He'd knelt down beside her and wiped the mud from her face, and he'd studied her in death, all the while wondering about her final moments of life. She would have lingered a while, been aware of the warm blood pumping from her throat, leaking out between the torn chunks of her flesh, spurting with every heartbeat, then growing weaker, until it became merely a thin trickle, melting into the soggy earth. The thought made him smile. She was no threat to him now. She was dead, and he was free. And so he'd leaned over, oh so gently, and he'd put his mouth upon hers, cold lips together. And then he'd kissed her. One last time. Chapter 5. God, it was freezing in here. It must be me, Lucy thought as she slid lower in the claw-footed tub, closing her eyes, trying to relax beneath the bubbles. The bathroom was large and luxurious, just like the rest of the house, but even with central heating, and even with the water as hot as she could stand it, she couldn't seem to get warm. What am I going to do? She could smell takeout pizza wafting up from the kitchen, and her stomach gave a queasy lurch. She could hear the muffled sound of the TV downstairs and Angela's rock music blaring from the next room. And though Aunt Irene was now en route to yet another very important meeting, Lucy could still picture that formidable frown waiting for them when she and Angela had gotten home. Lucy had been relieved when Irene ordered her straight upstairs and into a hot bath. She hadn't felt like explaining any more details about her evening. So what am I going to do? She felt drained and bone-tired, like her whole body had gone comatose and her brain had fizzled out. The cemetery, the girl, the warning. Everything seemed like a distant dream now, or something she'd seen in a horror movie. An out-of-body experience that had happened to someone else's body. "Hey!" Angela banged on the door. "Don't use up all the hot water." It was almost too much effort to answer. Groaning, Lucy roused herself and called back, "I'm not. And don't go to sleep and die in my bathtub." "I wouldn't dream of it." "Dinner's ready." "I'm not hungry." "Don't you like pizza?" "Not 3 nights in a row." Gently, she massaged her forehead. She could imagine Angela leaning against the other side of the door, filing her fingernails and admiring the shape of her hands. No wonder her cousin looked practically anorexic, she thought. There hadn't been a single healthy or home-cooked meal in this kitchen since Lucy had been here. The music abruptly shut off. "If you die in there, you'll bloat and be all wrinkled," Angela informed her. Lucy sighed. She listened to Angela's footsteps fading down the stairs. Then she closed her eyes and drifted lower into the water. "I have to do something. I have to tell somebody." She couldn't call from here, that was certain. She didn't have a cell phone, and it would be too risky to try to call the police from a phone inside the house. Too easy to be traced. But besides that, something else was bothering her. And even though she'd forced herself not to think about the obvious truth of the matter, she couldn't avoid it any longer. It had been lurking there in the farthest reaches of her mind, a mocking shadow keeping just beyond consciousness, ever since she'd made her gruesome discovery. But now she had to face it. Someone killed that poor girl. Someone had murdered that girl, and not mercifully. The death wound hadn't been clean or swift. Someone had hacked at her throat, leaving her alone and helpless and frightened, leaving her to bleed to death in the rain, which meant the murderer was still out there. And if I tell, he might find out. And if he finds out it was me, then he'll kill me too. Trembling, Lucy readjusted the loose coils of hair she'd pinned on top of her head. She wrung out her washcloth, molded it to her face, and eased farther down into the water, resting her head against the back of the tub. Could he have seen me? Could he have followed me? Again she thought back, trying to convince herself she was safe. It had been so dark, storming so hard, she'd had the hood of her jacket pulled down around her face. And if the murderer really had been close by, wouldn't he have stopped her then? Done whatever he had to keep her from leaving? No, something told Lucy that she and the girl had been the only ones out there in the cemetery, at least for those brief, terrifying moments. Still. A gust of wind rattled the bathroom window. Lucy jerked the washcloth from her face and sat up straight, her heart pounding. At least you were with her at the end. At least she wasn't alone. As the overhead light flickered, Lucy grabbed for her towel on the rack. Holding her breath, she waited. Within several minutes, the lights slowly regained brightness, so she dried off quickly, pulled on her nightgown, and hurried through the connecting door into her bedroom. Not my bedroom, she reminded herself grimly. My prison. For the first 2 days after she'd come here, she'd simply stayed in bed, sleeping and crying, then sleeping again, missing her mother so much that her soul felt raw. The containers of takeout food that Irene regularly left on her dresser went virtually untouched. She hated the stark white walls and carpeting. She hated the sleek white furniture that looked like something straight out of a decorating magazine. She'd been so depressed, she hadn't even bothered to put out any of her favorite personal things. What she'd brought with her was still packed in boxes and suitcases, stored upstairs in the attic, all of them painful reminders of her happy life that had died. "I'm sure you'll love your room, Lucy," Irene had assured her on the plane ride here. But Lucy had hated it at first sight, hated everything about it, including the sheer curtained sliding doors that opened side by side out onto a little wrought iron balcony, making her feel both exposed and accessible. She even hated the giant mulberry tree that grew beside it, the one that scraped and clawed at the railing and eaves, and made it sound as though someone were trying to break in and kill her every single night. God, Mom, what were you thinking sending me here? Sighing, Lucy shut off the overhead light and left just the lamp burning on the nightstand by her bed. She could hear Angela slamming cupboard doors in the kitchen and then tromping back up the staircase. Lucy gritted her teeth and counted to 5. Angela's CD player blasted through the upstairs, vibrating the floors, rattling the window panes. 10 ear-shattering seconds of rage and defiance. Lucy knew it was 10, for she'd clocked it many times, before the volume cut off and silence reigned again, everywhere but in Angela's headphones. It's a miracle she hasn't gone deaf by now, Lucy thought glumly. Rubbing her ears, she walked over and stood in front of the sliding doors. Her room was at the back of the house, separated from Angela's by their adjoining bathroom, and at the opposite end of the hallway from Aunt Irene. From here she could look down onto the manicured lawn, the brick patio and terraced wooden deck, the glassed-in hot tub, the swimming pool, covered now for the winter, the landscaped flower beds and mulched pathways, and discreetly camouflaged woodpile, all coated with a thin layer of frost. At the rear of the lawn stood a low stone wall with a gate, and beyond that a narrow pathway led through dense woods to a private stretch of lake. Despite the heavy rain, a pale gray fog had begun to ooze through the trees. Lucy watched it, strangely fascinated, as it wound its way toward the house, smooth and silent as a snake. There was no moonlight. Only an occasional burst of lightning managed to rip the storm clouds and illuminate the landscape below. Shivering, Lucy started to turn away. And then she saw something. What is that? Frowning, she leaned closer, squinting hard through the glass. Had she imagined it? That very slight movement just beyond the wall, as though one shadow had separated itself from all the others, as though it were hovering there, like a wisp of pale smoke, just on the other side of the gate. Come on, Lucy, get a grip. Of course there were shadows out there, millions of shadows out there, and of course things were moving, fog and wind and rain and— Some animal, Lucy whispered. A deer, probably. She'd spotted an occasional deer in the yard since she'd been here. Irene hated them, said they caused major damage to her expensive shrubs. She'd forbidden Angela to leave out food of any kind. Just a deer, Lucy told herself again, more firmly this time. And yet— Frowning, she pressed closer to the doors, lamplight soft behind her. Peaceful and private. Isn't that what Irene had said about this neighborhood? Yet Lucy could feel a vague sense of unease prickling up her spine, as though something far more ominous than a deer was out there in the woods, watching her. Don't be ridiculous. It's because of what happened tonight. You're only imagining things. She thought of the girl, of her own promise. She wondered again what she should do. She didn't want to stand here looking out anymore, but she couldn't seem to turn away from the dark. Her breath quickened. She could feel her heart fluttering in her chest. Only moments ago she'd been freezing, but now a peculiar warmth was spreading through her, hot liquid in her veins. Her favorite nightgown, much too thin for these unforeseen autumn nights, now seemed unusually constricting. She opened the first 3 buttons down the front and leaned forward, resting her forehead against the glass. Something moved on the corner of her balcony. Gasping, Lucy's head came up, and she peered anxiously out into the night. Just the tree, that stupid tree hitting the railing, nothing more. But even as she tried to reason with herself, she was already tugging at the doors, sliding them open to the wind. Rain swept savagely into the room. With a cry, Lucy grabbed both doors and, after a brief struggle, managed to lock them in place. Then she backed away and sat on the edge of her bed, soaking wet. What on earth were you thinking? She was cold again, cold to the bone, and besides that, she felt unbelievably stupid. And paranoid, she reminded herself glumly. Don't forget paranoid. As her mind flashed back to the cemetery, she tried to block it out. No wonder she was seeing watchers in the woods now, and lurkers on the balcony, and danger in every shadow. And thank God Angela was buried in her headphones right now, completely oblivious to the rest of the world. Lucy wasn't up for any more confrontations or excuses. Leaving her gown in the bathroom to dry, Lucy toweled off and changed into a warm pair of sweats. Then she shut off the lamp and tried to cocoon herself deep inside her blankets. She lay there wide-eyed, too exhausted to sleep. She lay there feeling numb, and each time a vision of the dead girl floated into her mind, she tried to think of other things. Home before, Mom before, my perfect and wonderful life before. She'd had friends, she'd been popular, she'd had fun, and she'd had ambitions. What were her friends doing now, she wondered sadly. She'd withdrawn from them more and more during Mom's illness, and since she'd come here to live, she'd scarcely thought about them at all. Hadn't written, hadn't even called. She'd promised a few of them to keep in touch, to send them her address. Why hadn't she? Because I hate it here so much. Because I'm so miserable, and I don't want them to know how horrible my life is now. Her thoughts swirled and faded. The storm continued to rage outside her windows, and after a very long time, she finally drifted off. She wasn't sure what woke her. It was a feeling rather than a sound. A slow, cold chilling at the back of her neck. A vague sense that she wasn't quite alone. Lucy struggled to open her eyes. She was lying on her side facing the sliding glass doors, and as lightning flashed beyond the rain-streaked panes, the room went in and out of shadow. "Lucy," a voice said softly. Raising herself on one elbow, Lucy stared. She could see the curtains blowing in, billowing like lacy feathers, though she knew it was impossible, that she'd already shut those doors, already bolted them tight against the wind. "Lucy?" Her eyes widened in alarm. A sob caught in her throat. "Mom?" She tried to struggle up in bed, strained her eyes to see. And yes, the curtains were moving, fanning out like delicate wings. Only there was something else there, too. A hazy figure silhouetted against the glass. She could see it now, though it was flimsy and formless, as sheer as those fine, gauzy curtains. "Mom!" Tears streamed down Lucy's cheeks. "Mom, is that you?" "Listen to me, sweetheart." And it was her mother's voice, but so sad, so sad. Why does she sound like that? So terribly sad and hopeless. "Mom." "Be careful, Lucy," the voice whispered, and it was already fading, scarcely more than a breath. "You're going to a place where I can't help you." "What do you mean, Mom? No, wait! Don't leave! Please don't leave me!" Lucy flung out her arms, reaching. But the mournful shadow was gone now, and the curtains hung pale and soft and deathly still. Chapter 6. A knock. 2 loud knocks and then another, firm and persistent, hammering their way into her warm, cozy dream. "Go away," Lucy mumbled. She was decorating the Christmas tree in their apartment. Mom was baking gingerbread men for all her 4th-grade students, and they were both singing carols at the top of their lungs, and Mrs. Manetti from downstairs was bringing up homemade soup later for all of them to share. "Wake up, Lucy, you'll be late." "Go away," Lucy said again, only this time the dream faded down a dark tunnel, and her eyes opened to hazy light and someone standing in the open doorway to the hall. "We've already discussed this," Irene said firmly. I said I'd give you 1 week to settle in. Today you're going to school." "Today?" She was wide awake now, the announcement finally sinking in, along with a feeling of panic. "But it's Friday. Why can't I wait till next week?" "Because one day will be difficult enough to get through, and you'll have the entire weekend to recover before you start fresh on Monday." "But it's too soon. I'm not ready." "You can ride with Angela, so hurry up." Irene didn't wait for a response, and this time Lucy didn't give one. She lay there with her face buried in the pillow, too stunned to move. Her eyes felt swollen, as though she'd been crying. Her whole body felt achy and stiff. She wondered if maybe she was catching the flu, yet there was a vague sense of uneasiness nagging far back in her mind. No, not the flu. Something else. Something dark and suffocating. Something gnawing at the distant edges of her mind. Something bad that she couldn't quite place. Something horrible. But what? Groaning softly, she turned onto her side. Her right hand was aching, as though she might have wrenched it in her sleep, so she propped herself on one elbow and leaned over to examine her palm. Memory slammed her full force. As every horror of last night came back to her in shocking, grisly detail, Lucy let out a cry and felt the room spin around her. How could she have forgotten, even for a moment? The girl, the grave, my promise. She'd hoped so much to be wrong, that somehow she'd only imagined it in her mind, that it had only been a nightmare, that she'd wake up this morning and realize the whole thing had never happened. But it had happened. And now, as Lucy stared down at her hand, she could see the evidence all too clearly, the truth etched deeply into her skin. It was a strange marking, not at all as it had looked last night, for the ugly welts and discolorations had practically faded away. Now there was only the smallest reminder, the pale puckered flesh of a tiny scar, stamped into the exact center of her right palm. It looked like a sliver of something, like a sliver of moon. That's it, a crescent moon. So perfectly formed, it seemed neither random nor accidental, as if some miniature branding iron had been used to sear a pattern into her flesh. No, that's crazy. Grabbing the blanket, Lucy rubbed it vigorously against her palm. These were crazy thoughts she was having, thoughts that didn't make sense, because this scar on her hand was just that, a scar, a wound, nothing more. She'd tried to help, and in their struggle the poor girl had scratched her, and eventually this little scar would fade too. But how did it heal so fast? Lucy let go of the blanket. Despite the fact that she'd been rubbing so hard, her scar wasn't even red. She stared at it in disbelief, remembering how gruesome her hand had looked last night, remembering the excruciating pain she'd felt when the girl had grabbed her in the cemetery. What's happening to me? Am I having some kind of nervous breakdown? Lucy! Angela's voice shocked her back to attention. The door from the bathroom flew open, and Lucy saw her cousin scowling at her from the threshold. "What am I, your private chauffeur?" Angela's miniskirt barely covered her crotch. Her designer sweater looked as if she'd spray-painted it over her chest. She looked like an expensive hooker. "You're not even up yet, and I'm so not waiting for you." "Yes," Lucy nodded, throwing off the covers. "Yes, I'm hurrying." The door slammed shut. As Lucy sat up in bed, she tried to ignore the sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. When had she eaten last? Sometime yesterday? So much had happened since then. So much confusion in her head. She couldn't think straight. She couldn't think at all. She closed her eyes, then opened them. Her gaze traveled slowly around the room. She could see the windows, the sliding doors, the slow dawn of an autumn morning struggling to break through. Mom. I saw Mom. Lucy's heart caught in her chest. Yes, Mom was here. She said something to me. Her mind tried frantically to remember. She could almost hear the tone of her mother's voice, could almost see her mother's face. But the words she'd spoken were completely gone. Frustrated, Lucy got up. She padded barefoot to the sliding doors and squinted down at the carpet, as if she expected to see a footprint or a distinctive clue, some confirmation of her mother's visit. She ran a tentative hand down the length of the curtains, and her eyes misted with tears. Of course she wasn't really here. It was just a dream. She wasn't here, and she wasn't a ghost either, because ghosts don't exist. Lucy opened the curtains and peered out. A watery sun was spreading across the backyard, and she could see Angela recklessly scooping seeds into all the bird feeders. The rain had stopped, but beneath a cold November sky lay the widespread destruction from last night's storm. Piles of wet leaves, splintered tree branches, strewn garbage, uprooted plants, even a few wood shingles and a broken shutter. And as Lucy's gaze shifted to the stone wall in back, she saw that the gate was standing open. Her heart clenched in her chest. She forced herself to take a deep breath. It doesn't mean anything. It was just the storm. Just the storm, Lucy repeated to herself. Of course nobody would have been out there watching her window in the middle of a storm. She'd just been feeling overly paranoid last night. As fierce as the wind had been, it was a miracle the gate was even still there at all. She let the curtains fall back into place. "Lucy!" Irene shouted. "Coming!" Lucy shouted back. She hurried to the bathroom, but couldn't resist checking the clothes hamper first. There were her clothes, right where she'd tossed them last night, totally covered in mud. What did you expect? Isn't that scar proof enough for you? Are you still hoping last night didn't happen? She picked up her toothbrush, squeezed toothpaste across the bristles. Think, Lucy, think. Why was it so hard to focus this morning? Why couldn't she brush her teeth without trembling? Maybe I can sneak out of school and find another payphone. Maybe I can pretend I have an emergency and borrow someone's cell phone. Cell phones can't be traced, can they? Lucy frowned at herself in the bathroom mirror. I'll have to go back to the cemetery on my own. I'll have to go back there and find her. It's the only thing I can do. Yet she knew in her heart it was pointless. She was certain the girl was dead. Had been dead now for nearly 12 hours. Not only that, but she'd been lost last night, panicky and disoriented. She didn't have a clue where the cemetery was. And even if you do manage to find the cemetery, even if you do manage to find the grave, what then? What if the killer had come back? What if the killer were there? What if he really did recognize her from last night? She'd be as good as dead. Sighing, Lucy leaned closer to her reflection. She had dark bruises under her eyes, and her normally tan complexion was pale. She'd never worn much makeup. Mom had always insisted that Lucy had a natural sort of beauty, but today she added a touch of blush and lipstick. Just for color, she told herself. Just for confidence, you mean? Angela's right, she sighed. I do look like a zombie. She didn't even know what outfit to put on. What did kids in Pine Ridge wear anyway? She wasn't prepared for the chilly autumn weather here, and she'd never needed warm clothes at home. No matter what she picked out this morning, she was sure to look stupid. She made a face at the mirror and tied her hair back in a ponytail. Then she went to her room, took jeans and a pale blue sweater from her dresser drawer, and pulled on thick socks and sneakers. Lucy, Angela is waiting. I'm coming. God, this was going to be an awful day. As if everything else weren't bad enough already. Just thinking of going into a new school and being introduced and having everyone stare at her made her feel sicker than ever. She could hear the TV as she came downstairs, pausing on the bottom step, Lucy listened nervously to a brief review of the local news. Nothing about a murder. No body discovered anywhere. Not knowing whether to feel relieved or not, she started into the kitchen when the sound of voices stopped her just outside the door. "You can't do this to me!" Angela cried angrily. "It's not fair!" Then Aunt Irene, cold and utterly calm. "I told you if you got one more speeding ticket, you'd be grounded. You had plenty of warning." "But the festival's this weekend!" "Keep your voice down. You're acting so high-strung. Are you coming down with something?" "Yes. Dreams. I'm coming down with dreams, Irene. Weird, sexy ones, all night long. Send me to the hospital." "Angela, will you please be mature this morning? Must we go through this every single day?" Angela finished. "I have to go to the festival. Everyone's going. I have to be there." "You should have thought of that before, and you should have known better than to think I wouldn't find out about this latest ticket. Oh, right, I forgot. Your personal friends on the police force. Or was it the judge this time?" "This discussion is over. You can use your car to drive to and from school, but nowhere else. There will be no social events of any kind until I say so." "It's not even about me, is it?" Despite Angela's sarcasm, Lucy could hear the threat of tears. "It's just about you looking bad in front of your important friends." "That's quite enough, Angela. If it was Lucy, you wouldn't ground her." "If it was Lucy, I wouldn't be having these problems." "Right." Angela's tone was suddenly as cold as her mother's. "Right, I forgot. 'Cause Lucy's so goddamn perfect." Lucy pressed a hand to her mouth. She heard the kitchen door fly open. "Angela, come back here," Irene ordered. "You have to take Lucy to school." "You take her," Angela threw back. "It was your idea to bring her here. You take her." The door slammed shut with a bang. As tears sprang to her eyes, Lucy flattened herself against the wall and fought down her own wave of anger. "Thanks a lot, Irene. Do you think you can get Angela to hate me just a little bit more?" "Lucy!" Irene fairly shrieked. Quickly, Lucy went back to the stairs, then came noisily down the hall again, as though she'd just arrived. "Yes, here I am. Sorry. Get in the car. We're already late." "I thought you said Angela—" "I forgot she had some errands to run before school. I'll be taking you. Where's your jacket?" It got so wet last night, Here, take this jacket of Angela's. She'll never miss it." "But—" "Just put it on, Lucy. I can promise you she will never wear it, simply because I gave it to her. And Angela would rather die than be seen in anything I pick out for her. I'm sure it will fit you nicely." "If you say so." Irene was silent for the whole drive. It wasn't until they pulled up in front of the high school that she finally graced Lucy with a comment. "I know classes have already started this morning, but as you know, I've spoken with Principal Hauser several times. He's assured me that everything's been taken care of, so all you need to do is go straight to his office. He'll be expecting you." "Thanks, I'll be fine." "I'm sure you will be. Have a nice day, Lucy." As her aunt drove off, Lucy stood there on the pavement and made a quick assessment of the school. 2-story buildings of ivy-covered brick, stone benches placed strategically around the wide, sweeping campus, a covered courtyard with tables and chairs, an outdoor stage, rows of bleachers and an athletic field in the distance. Lots of trees, lots of windows, lots of cars in the parking spaces, lots of students to face. Taking a deep breath, Lucy took one hesitant step toward the gate. Then she stopped. "You don't have to do this now. You can wait and go Monday. You can tell Irene you got sick and had to go home, and it's not really a lie, and it's not like one more day will make that much difference." Lucy turned slowly, her eyes scanning the sidewalk and street beyond. A quiet residential area, nothing but houses as far as she could see. But she'd noticed a post office and a grocery store on their drive here. Someone was sure to know where the cemetery was. She glanced over her shoulder at Pine Ridge High. Then she ducked her head and hurried away from the school.